Hello and welcome back to my channel. On this video, I'm going to talk about all of the books that I read in March of 2025, and there were about 36 of them. It was a really good reading month. I had a couple days off of work, which allowed me to binge read a couple of books extra than what I normally would, and looking forward to sharing with you about some of the books that I was able to get through this past month. So the first book that I picked up was Heavenly Bodies by Amani Aru, which I finally had both the audiobook and the up-to-date ebook that I could read together. And what I will say is I appreciated the world building in this book. I appreciated the level of detail, and also I can imagine reading the second book eventually when it's on audio. I don't know that I'm going to tackle it when it is just in ebook form, and I don't think it's on audio yet. But I did rate this one 4 out of 5 stars. I thought it was really interesting in terms of the plot building, the character development, and the world building. All right, then I picked up Dark Roads by Chevy Stevens, and this is a book basically about a couple different women who go missing, and one of them has a sister who comes looking for her, and there's kind of this convoluted plot about kind of how all of them are tied together. But I like Chevy Stevens. I feel like she has kind of these interesting premises that she brings into her novels. And this is not the first one that I picked up. I've actually read, several of her novels before, and they're pretty decent mystery thrillers. So I would recommend her backlist. Then I was able to read Ready Player One, which is the first book in the Ready Player One series by Ernest Cline. This book is super fun. If you are into gaming culture at all, you would probably like this book. It is basically about this man who dies, and he creates this competition for people to, through a bunch of different games and challenges, become inheritors of his legacy. And there is this teenage boy who's obsessed with this guy and has been trying to do all of these challenges, and eventually he ends up completing a number of these challenges and getting on the leaderboard. And I will say I had seen the film adaptation of this, and I got the film and the book mixed up because there was a part of the film that I was waiting for the entire book, and it never happens in the book. So I was like, okay, it's been a long time since I've read this book. I'd completely forgotten a lot of it. There is a Ready Player 2, which I was not able to get to this last month, but I do have on my list for the months ahead. Then I picked up a book called Hereafter by Amy Lynn, and this is a memoir. It's relatively short, relatively quick read. This is basically a story of a woman who is grieving the death of her partner. And it is basically about how she goes through a number of her own kind of medical issues. She's in her 30s, I believe, when this is happening. And so this was an untimely death of her partner. And she is not only grieving him, but also dealing with a bunch of her own stuff on the side. And it's causing kind of all of these challenges for her. And she definitely has moments where she's kind of questioning it. Does she want to go on? I think it's a really poignant narrative of grief, if you're interested in kind of grief narratives. And as I was listening to it, I listened to it on audio, I was thinking about just the process of this author kind of working through this to the point where she could write about it. And I thought it was really powerful. Then I read a book called Livy Alone. This is by Barry Eisler. It is the first book in the Livy Alone series. Livy Alone is a detective who specializes in catching people who do sex trafficking. And as a child, she was trafficked herself. And so this is something that does come up in this particular book. She's also kind of a vigilante who randomly, or maybe not so randomly, kills people, particularly people who engage in sexual assault and trafficking. And so she's kind of a bit of a wild card in terms of a character, and she does have other books in this series. This was just the first one kind of introducing her. She also shows up in some of Barry Eisler's later series, which I was really intrigued to see as well. So I would definitely continue reading this series. Then I read The Unhoneymooners. This is by Christina Lauren. Christina Lauren is a 2-author combo, 2 women who write together under that name. And I've read several books by this duo, and The Unhoneymooners is basically the story of a woman who goes on the honeymoon of her sister because her sister and a bunch of people in the wedding party become ill. And she goes on the honeymoon with the best man, who is one of the only other people who doesn't become ill during this wedding. It's a food poisoning thing. And so they go on this honeymoon together and of course start to have a relationship. And like many Christina Lauren books, I wouldn't say this is my favorite, but I feel like it's a pretty solid romantic comedy. Then I picked up Mary Karr's The Art of Memoir. This is a book that I had been wanting to read for a long time. Mary Karr is very well known for a number of different books that she has written that are memoirs. And I wasn't really sure what to expect from this book, other than I knew that I'd been wanting to read it for a while. And it was really interesting and really good. It's kind of a combination of like her wisdom and advice and experience combined with like a study of other people's memoirs and what they have done and how they have done it well or not so well. And I was like, I think I read this in like one sitting. I was completely sucked in, found it to be really interesting. Highly recommend that one. Then I picked up Home is Where the Bodies Are. This is by Geneva Rose. And this book has a great premise. It's basically these three siblings come back home, I think after the death of their mother. And their father, I believe, is missing. Like he's gone missing years and years ago. And then the mother dies. And they come home and they're going through her belongings. And they find this videotape where both of their parents are on this video. And there's like a dead body and like it's clear that they've been involved in some kind of crime. And I just thought that was such an interesting premise of like, especially when you learn something about, you know, people that you thought you knew and all of a sudden you like realize you didn't know them or they've done something you weren't expecting. And so I really liked this book. I liked where it ended up in terms of the plot as well. It was kind of a couple of twists at the end that were pretty fun. Okay, then I picked up a bunch of books that were kind of due back at my library. This happened to me twice this month where I had to like binge a bunch of things that were due back. So this is the first binge. I read a book called Saving Noah by Lucinda Berry. I've read a couple other books by Lucinda Berry as well. I tend to enjoy, like she has kind of some interesting plot premises as well. This particular book is about the mother, primarily, the mother of a teenage boy, and the teenage boy is basically a pedophile. And he turns himself in because he has molested some younger girls. And it basically goes to like a detention center and then gets out of the detention center and has to be like reintegrated into his family. He has a younger sister, and this causes a bunch of tension with his parents. This is a relatively short book. It was relatively quick. I listened to it on audio, but it reminded me a little bit of We Need to Talk About Kevin, which is another book that is about basically like a teenage boy who's a psychopath, basically, and he ends up doing a school like shooting, and this is kind of part of just the book overall. And that is by Lionel Shriver. And I loved that book. I thought it was just fantastic. It was such an interesting kind of portrayal of motherhood and like, what do you do when your child is evil, basically. And this book, I would say, did not go that far. The child is not seen as evil. He's seen as a very, in some ways, empathetic character, which is kind of an interesting stretch just because of the nature of what the plot is about. However, I thought it was a really interesting look at like, basically, what do you do when your child does something that you disagree with or you know is a crime or you know is wrong? And how do you continue like support your child and love your child when they have this other thing that they're kind of dealing with? So really interesting book. Would recommend that one as well. Then I picked up a book called Rhythm, Chord, and Malikin by Mariana Zapata. This is a romance about two young people who are kind of traveling with a band. The male main character is in the band. The female main character is like the twin sister, I think, or the sister of another bandmate. And then she begins to have a romance. I will say that some Mariana Zapata books, one example is Culty. I was completely sucked in, completely obsessed, so good. I didn't get the same impression from this. I'm starting to go through her backlist and read her earlier works, and I definitely think this is an author who gets stronger as she's writing more, and she's like plotting in a different way, and the character development feels different. Some of this early stuff, it's not that it's not good, but it's not as good as some of the things that I've read of her later stuff. All right, then I read a book called None of This Is True by Lisa Jewell. And this is kind of a twisty thriller about two women who run into each other at this bar, I think, and they find out that they're birthday twins, that they are the same age, they were born in the same hospital on the same day, and they become kind of embroiled in each other's lives. And one of them has a podcast, and it's kind of like I don't think it's like a true crime podcast, but she does like interviews. And so she starts interviewing this birthday twin woman who ends up that she had married very young, this older man. And so there was kind of a question about his intentions of like marrying such a young girl. And it gets really twisty. And towards the end, it's like, very twisty. I mean, there's all kinds of things that get kind of added into the plot. It was definitely one of those like turn the pages thrillers. Like if you were gonna need like an airplane read or something like this, I might pick it up. All right, then I read a book called Never Lie by Frida McFadden, and I have been working through the backlist of Frida McFadden. This is one of those authors that you just see kind of everywhere, and I feel like she's pumping out a lot of books in a similar genre. They're very page-turny. Like they have like cliffhanger at the end of chapters kind of thing. And this is basically the story of this couple who goes to look at a house that they want to buy, and it's like this abandoned house. And they get there and they realize this is the house of a therapist who went missing. And I don't think it's too spoilery to say, at some point they find this secret room that has all of her tapes, and the woman starts like listening to the tapes of this woman's patients. And it's just like this very, and there's like at every turn, there's like, and then there's a trap door, and then there's like this, painting that's like moving on its own. And I mean, it has almost like a gothic mystery element to it, this particular book, not all of her books, but this one. It was super fun. I was like totally willing to just go there and enjoy, some of the plot twists, and you get this nice reveal at the end, which was also really fun. All right, then I picked up David Baldacci's Absolute Power. And this is basically a book about, the premise is there is a thief. He is in the house of a wealthy couple. And while he is in the house of the wealthy couple, the President of the United States comes into the home with his mistress. And while they're in the home having, relations, she dies. She gets killed for reasons that I won't go into all the details, but it's bad. And this guy witnesses it happening and is kind of like somewhat torn because he's there as like a criminal and is like not quite sure what to do. And then you get this like whole novel of like all of this unfolding basically. And he runs, and then people find out who he is. The Secret Service is obviously part of this. He has a daughter. The daughter has like this ex-fiance who's like involved. There's lawyers. There's all these different, it's almost like a legal drama, crime thriller combined a little bit. But I like David Baldacci. I think he's so popular for a reason. I would like to read more of his backlist. And this was one that was fun to revisit. I'm pretty sure I have read this and seen the film before. It did make me want to rewatch the film as well. Okay, also this month I read the Brown Sisters trilogy by Talia Hibbert. The first one is called Get a Life, Chloe Brown. The second book in the series is called Take a Hint, Danny Brown. And then the third book in the series is called Act Your Age, Eve Brown. And it is basically a romance of each of the sisters that are obviously related to each other. And they each have different quirks is maybe like not quite the right word. There's quite a bit of neurodiversity in this trilogy. Like one of the sisters identifies as autistic. I think that might be the first book in the trilogy. But basically, I would say of the trilogy, I liked the first book the best. I felt like the other two were fine, but like in terms of just like how the first book came to be, it was basically about a woman and her neighbor, and how and there were just kind of some interesting complexities there. Like he was an artist and is kind of trying to figure out his way, in the world, as is she, but for different reasons. And they kind of have this trade that they're doing where she's like helping him with like a professional website, and like, so there's some complexity and also some depth to the relationship that they start to have. And I didn't always feel that depth in the later two books, but I would guess that that's a matter of opinion. But I did enjoy this series, and it's one that I've been looking at for a long time. I also got through 3 of the books in the Tattered and Torn series. I had read the first book last month, and then I got to the second book, which is called Falling Embers, the third book, which is called Hidden Waters, and then the fourth book, which is called Shattered Sea. And each of the books in this particular series, Catherine Cowles is the author, and she's really known for kind of mystery, small town suspense, romance. And I really like romance suspense as a subgenre when it's done well. And in these cases, I really did like the plotting. There's this interconnected family where basically you have a storyline of I guess it's kind of like two different factions of this town. There's the faction that is like the law-abiding, law enforcement. One of the sons of this family is the sheriff. And then you have this other faction that is kind of like off the grid, anti-government, and a couple of the female main characters in this series come from this side of the town. And that side of the town that is kind of like anti-government and off the grid is, at least in the case of these two girls, very abusive. And so they're trying to get themselves out. They're like, there's a lot of domestic violence storyline, and they're trying to leave. And there is, in the first book, basically a situation where a man from the anti-government faction kidnaps a child from the law-abiding faction, and the daughter of this man who's the kidnapper gets her rescued. And this gets her like basically blackballed from this community because she turned in her father. And that's like, there's a lot of complexity to that storyline, and there's like interconnected, interwoven stories of all of that throughout the rest of the series, because this woman who rescues, you know, this kidnapped child comes back to town as an adult and is like trying to like reintegrate back into the law-abiding side of town. And there's a whole like family dynamic of like found family, and how that family of the girl she rescued like comes around her and is trying to support her. That's just book one, which I know I talked about last month. But the other books in this series, you get different kinds of lenses on different characters that were really interesting. So I'm really looking forward to finishing the 5th book in this series in this upcoming month, and would definitely recommend that one. All right, then I picked up a book called Authentically Izzy. This is the first book in the Skymar series by Pepper Basham. I had not read this author before. What I would say about this particular book is it's basically a kind of literary romance that is very book reference heavy. So if you like books about books, and if you like books that make literary references, like, I would absolutely pick this up. I found it to be slightly heavy-handed in the literary references, which is surprising for me because normally I would like that kind of thing. But I felt like it was almost a little bit too much and got in the way of some of the like character development and connection. But I did think it was really charming, and I would definitely recommend this one if that sounds like it's kind of up your alley. Next up, I picked up a book called Be a Warrior in Business by Nipendra Singh. This was my NetGalley choice for the month. I'm trying to read a NetGalley book and do a review every month. And what I would say about this book is I did highlight quite a bit as I was going through it. There were some takeaways that I found helpful, but there were also a lot of like platitudes in this book that, as somebody who's owned a business now for almost 10 years, I was like, yeah, this is pretty basic stuff. And I will also say there was a lot of like warrior language and war language and battle language that just kind of turned me off. Like, it just wasn't something that I really could connect with. When I think about owning a business, I don't think about it in that capacity. So I think that there were some things to take away, but I don't know that this is one that I would like pick up again or go back to. Okay, next up I picked up a book by S.A. Cosby called All the Sinners Bleed. And I've read at least one other book by S.A. Cosby that was kind of like a heist thriller. And this one is more of like a serial killer mystery where you have this small town, there is a black sheriff, and he encounters this situation with a serial killer. And the book starts with like basically like a school shooting, and then it kind of like uncovers this other set of things that's like been happening in this small town. I really liked this book. I think that S.A. Cosby is playing a lot with genre and across the different books I've read, and there's a third one that I'm aware of that I haven't had a chance to read yet. And I think that it's just incredibly well written. It was a little bit of like a literary take on like a mystery thriller. It reminded me a little bit of All the Colors in the Dark by Chris Whitaker in terms of like its literary elements that got included, which I think this other book did as well. I would definitely recommend this, and I would definitely pick up his third book that I haven't read yet. I'm looking forward to looking at that soon. All right, then I picked up a book called When Women Were Dragons by Kelly Barnhill. I loved this book. Super creative. It's basically the story, it's kind of like almost an oral history of this time in the 1950s when women literally turned into dragons in the United States. And it like talks about their families and what happened. And there's like these clips from like scientists about how like the government was trying to hide that this was happening. And I was fascinated the whole time. I loved the family narrative. There's like this young girl whose aunt turns into a dragon. So I love that whole narrative. And then her family ends up like adopting the aunt's child, and it becomes like her sister because they have to hide the fact that like this happened. There were so many layers, and it is clearly like a feminist bent, you know, in terms of the role of women and the role of women as mothers and as wives. And obviously some of these dragons become like violent and like take like revenge basically on some of their partners and people who've like wronged them. It was a really interesting and creative novel, and I would absolutely pick up something else by this author. I would absolutely read this again, you know, at a later point. It'd be a great book club book. Like this was one that I just thought, I'd heard about it for a while, and I'm so glad that I picked it up. I really, really enjoyed that one. All right, then I picked up As Long as the Lemon Trees Grow by Zulfa Kato. I think I'm getting that right, pronunciation wise. And this is basically a book about a war in Syria, and this woman who is in the medical community. She's not really trained as a medical doctor, I don't think. I think she's like a pharmacist, and I'm assuming that when they say pharmacist, it means the same thing as it does here in the United States. I could be wrong, maybe she is some kind of doctor, but she basically gets pulled into like treating a bunch of people in this war, and it's like very traumatic. And she also has this romance, you know, with this male main character. They're trying to decide, are they staying, are they going, are they able to leave like this conflict? And there's a couple interesting little twists in this. She does basically create this kind of like imaginary character to help her survive like this trauma. And there's a couple like interesting twists around that that come up later in the book that I really did enjoy and did not see coming. And it was just beautifully written. I mean, this was one that, again, very literary, and I appreciated learning a lot more about kind of this conflict in Syria that I didn't really have any background with, so would recommend that one too. All right, then I picked up a book called The Indifferent Stars Above by Daniel James Brown. This is a book about the Donner Party, which I have heard jokes about and kind of references to, but didn't really understand what it was. And this is a very harrowing book to tell this story of basically this group of people who get stuck when they're traveling from across multiple states, and they basically get stuck in the winter with like no food and no shelter, and they're all dying, and they're trying to kind of find their way back to civilization. And the thing that the Donner Party is most known for is that there was cannibalism that was happening, you know, during this situation that they found themselves in. And the author of this book basically tells a story through the lens of one of the women who was kind of a younger woman who I think left either with her fiance or like this person that she recently married, and she was like part of this like Donner Party that went on this I hesitate to call it an adventure, but I mean it started that way, and then of course it kind of like devolves into, you know, this pretty horrible situation. But I felt like this was a very informative book, and it told the story in such a way that it was engaging, despite the fact that the material was a little bit hard in terms of just like understanding what actually happened, you know, to this group of people. And we've learned more and more over time, you know, about what that situation was like for them. Okay, then I picked up All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr, and I feel like I could probably just reread this book over and over again. I have reread it like 3 or 4 times at this point, and I wanted to reread it again because it is now a Netflix series, and so I wanted to watch that and kind of see the adaptation. And this is basically the story of a girl who is in Europe during the war, and she is blind, and her father has basically tried to not prepare her for the war, but like prepare her for life, to understand like how to navigate in the world as a blind person. And so you get a lot of flashbacks about that and kind of what that situation was for them. And then her father basically goes missing. She's taken in by an uncle. And then there's this whole other side narrative of this SS officer basically, who is a radio specialist, and he's like going around trying to fix radios and find people who are illegally broadcasting on the radio. And this blind girl is illegally broadcasting, and so their paths kind of cross. I'm probably not explaining this very well, but it's beautifully written, and I find that it's one of those books that it has a comforting ending, but also has like enough depth, throughout the book that I could just return to it again and again, which I have and will probably continue to do. All right, then I picked up as kind of a palate cleanser, the Getting Things Done workbook by David Allen. David Allen wrote a book called Getting Things Done. It's very famous. He goes through like a series of steps to basically organize your systems. And I had not read that book in a while, and I thought, oh, I'll pick up the workbook and it'll kind of like give me reminders of what all this is. What I will say is it did work to give me the reminders. I appreciated, kind of being walked through some of the steps and the Getting Things Done philosophy. There's a heavy emphasis in getting things done around paper, which I think is just starting to get outdated because so many of our systems are electronic now. And he does reference that a little bit, but I do feel like the emphasis on like paper files and things like that is a little bit just like not easy to connect with. However, I do think his overall premise of kind of how to organize material and move things through like a pipeline of your productivity is still pretty right on. All right, then I picked up Pretend You're Mine by Lucy Score. This is the first book in the Benevolence series. And I'm actually looking at the description to remind myself, like, what is this about? Okay, I remember. So there's a male main character who is about to be deployed, and he encounters this female main character basically through chance. And he ends up like hiring her to work in his office, and they begin to have this romance. And he's feeling very resistant to having a long-term relationship because he's about to be deployed. And yeah, they're kind of falling in love. The thing that I would say was a little bit challenging for me about this novel, which I have not always felt about Lucy Score novels, particularly her romances, is it felt a little bit like insta-love. Like they are really insta-lust, and there was just no depth to the relationship between this man and this woman. And eventually we're supposed to like believe that there's depth, but it didn't feel like they took all the steps to get there in terms of the plot and the character development. So I was like entertained, by the story. But there are other books that Lucy Score has written that I felt like really went there in terms of like the relationship depth, and you understood the background of these characters and like why they were connected. And I didn't get that as much. I also feel like one of Lucy Score's strengths is that she writes these like amazing side characters, and there's like this found family element in a lot of her books. And that wasn't really what I saw in this particular book either. So again, I feel like similar to Mariana Zapata, I'm kind of reading through the backlist, and the books get stronger as they go. So the further back you go, the books are not always as satisfying. Still worth going to the backlist, I think, just to kind of see what's there. But I found Lucy Score's more recent books stronger in terms of both kind of how she's developing the relationships between her characters and also all of these kind of side characters that are super fun. Okay, then I read a book called Out of the Woods by Hannah Bonham Young. I have read several books by Hannah Bonham Young, and in my opinion, she can do no wrong. Thus far, I have loved pretty much absolutely everything she has written. She has great disability representation in her books. She has a wonderful, amazing book about like these two young people who are like fostering children because of something that's gone on with their family, and they end up living together, and it's a great like romance story. This particular book is about side characters that are from another book called Out on a Limb, that is basically a pregnancy narrative of a woman and a man who have kind of a one-night stand. She becomes pregnant, and he is wanting to like stay in connection with her because she's having his child, and they end up moving in together and having a romance, and they both have limb differences, and so this is kind of why the Out on a Limb becomes the title. This one, Out of the Woods, is the best friend of the female main character from Out on a Limb, and so she and her partner have known each other since they were like teenagers. They have been married for many years, but they're starting to have kind of like a breakdown in their relationship. And so they go on this like hiking trip to try to strengthen their marriage. And it has great side characters, great banter, very deep connection between the male main character and the female main character. And basically the way that the author dedicates this book is something along the lines of like, it's for people who met your partner before you like fully came into yourself. And there have been several people who've been offering reviews of this book who have basically said like, this is like, they feel so seen, you know, like reading this book because they met their partners very young, or they just identify with kind of what's going on in this book. So once again, I think this book is great. I would recommend any of the backlist of this author. I think she just does a wonderful job. All right, then I picked up A Killing Cold by Kate Ellis Marshall. And Kate Ellis Marshall is an author that I first encountered when she wrote a young adult novel. And it was basically this like survivalist story of this girl and her father in like the Alaskan wilderness or something. I may be getting some of those details wrong, but I loved it. I loved her approach. And then she started writing stuff that was a little more adult, and it's been a little bit hit or miss for me. Like I'm not always fully enjoying it as much as I really liked that YA book. This book, I would say, landed somewhere in the middle. It's not as good, I don't think, as what I found in that YA novel, or it may be good in terms of her skill as a writer. Like, I think that her skill continues to get better over time. I just happen to like that YA. Like, there was something about it, about like the survivalist like narrative that I really enjoyed. This particular book, A Killing Cold, is basically about this woman who is engaged to be married to this man, and he's in a wealthy family, and they go out into these like cabins in the woods, and it's like her time to like meet his family and like engage his family before they get married. And when she goes there, she kind of has this memory of the place, and then in one of these cabins she finds a picture of herself as a child, and she realizes that there's some connection between like her and this family. This gets super twisty by the end of the book, and it's a little bit just unbelievable, like how twisty it gets. I think something I really liked about kind of the YA survivalist story that she wrote is that it was simplistic in its execution, but just like super engaging because of what was happening with the plot. This one felt way more complex in its execution, but it was still engaging and I still enjoyed it, and I would absolutely continue to pick up books by this author. All right, next I picked up a book. This is the second binge from my library. We're entering into, I was trying to get through a bunch of books. So A Killing Cold was the first one. The second book that was due back that I had to get through was called This Is a Love Story by Jessica Soffer. And this is basically a love story about Central Park in New York. It's about New Yorkers. It's about this couple that has been coming to Central Park. It's about the park itself. If you are someone who loves New York and you love books about New York, I would absolutely just make this an auto pickup because it has these like very clear vibes of like these New York vibes. I will also say it is basically the story of this man and this woman, and the woman is dying, and they've been in this relationship for a long time. And as someone who's like also been in a pretty lengthy relationship, 20 plus years with my partner, there were moments in this book that were just heartbreaking and very lyrical, very just like, it did not move me to tears, but I would not be surprised if other people are moved to tears by this book and some of the things that the author is talking about. I think that I enjoyed it from the perspective of just the history of this relationship and like what this couple was kind of going through together, and they went through some difficult times, and then obviously they've entered into this difficult time of her illness, but also just this like landscape of New York and how that was kind of almost like a third character that was coming into the book. Really well done. Just I thought it was beautifully written and would absolutely recommend that one. All right, then I picked up a book called Beautiful Ugly. This is the most recent book by Alice Feeney. And I've read at least one other Alice Feeney that I really liked. I think she does a good job of setting up like some interesting like mystery thriller kind of twists. This is also a mystery thriller. It is about this man whose wife goes missing, and then like a year later, he ends up going to this island to do like a writing retreat, and he thinks he sees her there. And it sets off this kind of like chain of events. The end of this book had like a kind of an unbelievable twist, but I was like willing to go there. It was fun. I enjoyed where the author took us. And there's also some things throughout the book that are kind of unbelievable narrator, and you're not kind of sure what's going on. And that also gave kind of an interesting vibe to the book as well. So I enjoyed that. All right, then I picked up What Happened to the McRaes. This was also a library book that was due back, and I had heard at least one person online talking about how much they loved this book. It's basically the story of this man and this woman who live in a small town, and for unknown reasons, they've been married for like 15 plus years. For unknown reasons, the male main character leaves, like kind of suddenly. And in the way that this book starts, he's basically come back because his father, who lives in a small town and is still like connected to his ex-wife, has like a stroke. And so he has to come back into town, take care of his father. And we get this entire like backstory of like what happened in this marriage and what caused this like rift where he felt like he had to leave. And then when he comes back into town, he's basically given this opportunity to like coach this hockey team and stay a little bit more long-term. So he starts interacting more with this ex-wife, and you start to kind of get an understanding of what happened. I found this to be really compelling. I could see this being turned into a film like pretty easily just because of the nature of the story. But also I would love to kind of follow up on like what happened to a lot of these characters. Like it's a standalone as far as I'm aware, relatively recent in terms of its release. And I'm not sure if I mentioned the author. Her name is Tracy Lang. I would absolutely read more from this author as well based on this particular book. All right, then I picked up The Last Year of the War. This is by Susan Meissner. I had run across Susan Meissner as like a historical fiction writer a few weeks back, maybe a couple months back, and I'd never heard of her before. And so I did a quick search at my library and like saw that we had, a few things available, and I just picked one. This is the story of two teenage girls who are in a camp basically during World War II in the United States. They're sent to kind of like an internal camp. One of the girls is from a family that's Japanese and the other girl is from a family that's German. And they both end up basically being sent back with their families to their countries of origin. And this is something that happened during the war, where people who were living in the United States and had lived there for quite some time were basically shipped back to their home countries and expected to just figure it out. And so you see this like very long-term storyline of teenage all the way up to like elderly with these two women and the relationship that they have over time and how their lives basically unfolded, after the situation that they had when they were teenagers, when they first met. I really like this. I would absolutely read another book by this author. I mean, historical fiction for me can be a little bit hit or miss. And I'm usually a little careful about like who I pick up because it's not always a genre that I enjoy. But I like when it's well written, and I really did enjoy this one. All right, just a few more left. And then I read Scythe and Sparrow. This is the third book in the Ruinous Love trilogy by Brynne Weaver. I believe this is the final book in the trilogy, except there was a note at the end of this book that basically implies there could be a fourth book. And this is basically a trilogy about serial killers who fall in love with other serial killers, and three of them happen to be siblings, or I think two of the three are siblings, and that are having kind of different romances. And of the three, I liked the first book the best. I felt like it had the most kind of uniqueness to it. Once you read the first book, the other two, I don't want to say that they're formulaic, but like they're kind of, they're from the same playbook, in terms of what's happening in book one. And so book one was kind of the most surprising and unique to me. But I enjoyed book three, and I thought that it offered a nice wrap up at the end, particularly around some of the other characters you're meeting in the first two books. All right, then I picked up a book called Absolution by Cara Ramsay. This is the first book in the Anderson and Costello mystery series. And I had seen this author. She has a couple different series. I had never read her before. And I found this book, it's been a while since I've read like a traditional police procedural, and this definitely falls into that category. It's very well plotted. It kind of goes back and forth between a bunch of different narratives. And I will say, like, I wasn't thrilled with the ending, but I almost didn't even care because of how well plotted it was throughout like 90% of where the book was going. And I could absolutely see reading more. I think this is a series that has at least 9 books in it, if I'm remembering correctly. And I would definitely pick up the next one just to kind of see where the author takes the series. And there's kind of this also like back and forth in time with the mystery that's happening. It's connected to a mystery that happened like several decades before. This all gets kind of like wrapped up in the end of the book. So it was a good like first experience with this new author for me. And then the last book that I read in the month of March is The Vacation by John Marrs. And John Marrs is a speculative fiction writer. He also writes mystery thrillers. He often writes books that have like multiple POVs, points of view. And this is a book that falls into, I would say, kind of the contemporary mystery, multiple POV, but not speculative. And it's basically the story of all of these people who are in this like hostel in Los Angeles. And they all come into it for different reasons. They all have different storylines. Throughout the book, we start to kind of like see how all these storylines are somehow connected with each other. And it's smart. I do feel like this is one of, if I remember correctly, this is one of John Marrs' earliest books that got like republished in the US. I think he's from the UK. And similar to other books I've talked about, there's kind of a theme this month of like reading backlist and like it not being quite as strong as kind of the more contemporary or most recent books that authors have done. That said, there's something about watching the trajectory of an author over time and seeing like where they started and where they're ending and what is the trajectory of that work, that kind of backlist over a period of time, that I find really interesting. This is why I always like to dive into backlist books, because sometimes an author doesn't really get recognized or like hit their stride until they have a more, contemporary book that gets picked up by, whatever source that like makes it popular. And I always like to go back and say like, where did they start? And I find it really interesting to see what that pathway is. So the last book I read was that John Marrs book, and I did enjoy it. I thought it was really interesting. So I think that was 37 books that I read in the month of March. So a really good productive reading month for me. And I hope you'll stick around and take a look at my April to be read pile video that I'll be releasing soon. And until the next video, happy reading.